Blessings, saints, and it's my honor and pleasure to be with you. I hope that you've had a fabulous year in general and also a fabulous year of Bible reading. And so here is my 12th and now final Bible summary video for the reading that we did in December, which excitingly brings us through the end of our scriptures. So I'll jump right in and we'll go ahead. And so at the beginning of this month, we picked up in First Corinthians, partway through in chapter 9. And I love kind of how it all starts off here in chapter 9, where, Paul is literally like, the rights of the apostles, give me my food, which I think is pretty funny. In chapter 11, we have the institution of the Lord's Supper, which is pretty significant because this is the first sort of written account of the Lord's Supper because this book predates the Gospels in authorship. And then First Corinthians 12 through 14 has lots of the great quotables from First Corinthians. It talks about spiritual gifts, how we have many members, one body. We have Paul's riff on the word love that has been read at many weddings, and so on and so forth. As I've said in my previous videos, Second Corinthians really is Third Corinthians. There was at least one letter that was lost in between. So we feel like we're arriving in the middle of an argument. And so while that is awkward, there's some really great stuff. Second Corinthians chapter 4, for example, talks about this treasure we have in clay jars. Basically, Paul saying that God's glory is made clear by the extreme lack of magnificence and perfection of God's servants. And so I think that that's kind of cool. Second Corinthians chapter 5 talks about things being made new and other great goodies. And Second Corinthians 8 and 9 on generosity. So definitely check those out. Then we have the letter to the Galatians. It's pretty interesting, lots on faith, and that's important. What I love is on chapter 2, we have Paul describing a beef that he had with Peter and how he rebuked Peter to his face for no longer eating with the Gentiles. One thing I always wonder about is that, we talk about Peter and Paul together, and, I'm wondering how much beef did they really have? And was it the kind of beef where, like, they fought a bunch, but they loved each other? Or did they fight a bunch and kind of just tolerated each other? We know that Peter, got to heaven before Paul. And so I'm wondering, when Peter was at the gates, was he like, Paul, why are you here so soon? I mean, I don't know. I've always wondered about that. But that's a little ditty from Galatians chapter 2. In chapter 5, it's interesting because they talk about freedom. And in particular, how we're invited to use our freedom. And it says, to use freedom not for self-indulgence, but rather to serve one another. And, in these day and age, whether we're talking about safety with COVID and other things, there's been a lot about, what it means to have freedom and freedom for what. And so I appreciate that. And, it finishes off with admonishments to bear one another's burdens. We have Paul's letter to the Ephesians, which is a happy letter generally. Chapter 4 is famous for talking about vocation, how different people are called different things, so check that out. And in chapters 5 and 6, we see something that is unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, but is very common within Pauline letters, especially the later ones, where, talking about how people must obey their masters, obey their husbands. There are different things that I think we as people of faith are called to wrestle with. That we have our scriptures, outlining very beautiful things and also things that, at least from my point of view, I'll own, or can be very difficult to wrestle with. And so Ephesians 5 and 6 is definitely full of that. We have Philippians, the letter to the Philippians, which is a beautiful, beautiful book. In Philippians chapter 4, there's some wonderful exhortations, including a very famous one that's often used in blessings, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding. So Philippians chapter 4 is awesome. We actually had that as part of our wedding, me and my wife, Susan. But then we also have a little bit of drama. In Philippians chapter 2, we hear about some dissension in the ranks, and Paul basically saying that only Timothy was reliable to him. It makes me wonder if perhaps, after as Paul got on in age and was imprisoned for a while, that there was a next generation of leaders in the church who were sort of hoping that he would fade into the background. Just makes me curious about that. The letter to the Colossians is also really interesting books, lots of rules for Christian households. What you do it for God. Interesting little book. Then we have the books of the Thessalonians. These are significant because they're considered some of the earliest ones. And what we see is a lot around heaven and hell. In both of these books, we get a sense of the way that the first Christians were ones who were very much waiting for this big judgment and this big return to come during their lifetimes. And so that's really present and Thessalonians. Then we get the letters to Timothy. Once again, these were letters not to a community, but to a person. Even if these books weren't likely written by Paul, we're pretty sure they weren't. They do, I think, in some ways show the tenderness in the relationship that Paul had for his protege Timothy, perhaps the son he never had. You see a lot more about the institution of the church. And so chapter 3 talks about qualifications for bishops and deacons, shows a more established and domesticated church. Part of the reason we think that it was written so much later and was probably not likely written by Paul. But nonetheless, a lot of interesting things for that. And then 2 Timothy chapter 2 is actually really neat. There's some encouragement for people who are struggling and dealing with adversity for being persons of faith. And so, while a lot in the Timothy books can be a little suspect and institution heavy, I think 2 Timothy chapter 2 is worth checking out. We have the letter to Titus, once again, a lot around the institution. You also get the sense that they were contending with some controversies. And so we're at a point in our church where, people who think and preach and teach differently are seen as problematic as opposed to just being diversity. And so something to look at. The book of Philemon is a really interesting one. It's written where Paul has this person who has come to become like a son and a great advocate to him in Onesimus, who was a slave, and he's writing Philemon and saying, hey, if you can free him, I'd love to keep him, but otherwise take him back and have him not be a slave anymore. And so really interesting short book, and I don't know, makes me wonder about what the backstory was with that. We have the letter to the Hebrews, which is one of the ones that sort of serves along with Romans, in my opinion, as sort of these apostolic sort of outlines of the faith. And so there's a lot outlining the faith, a lot around how we are saved by Christ. And so a lot of ideas in Christianity around what Jesus' death meant and how it saved everybody and the sacrifice and all that comes out of this book. As I've mentioned before, I think I really zero in on chapters 11, which talks about by faith and gives a really neat riff on the word faith and talks about the history of the persons of faith. We have chapter 12 where it talks about the cloud of witnesses, which is very important as we baptize people into that cloud of witnesses. And chapter 13, we have that really, really awesome line where it talks about hospitality to strangers and how some, by doing this, entertain angels, making reference to Abraham. And so Hebrews is an awesome book. And if you're feeling theological, definitely read through Hebrews again. We read the book of James, which, as I mentioned before, talks a lot about what it means to live a life of faith. I think if I were to pull something from James and say it captures it, faith without works is dead. Amen. Then we have the books of Peter, and interesting, it talks about sort of staying true, even when faith is countercultural, which I think is a really important message for all of us. We get a little bit on baptism in chapter 3 and on being stewards of God's grace in chapter 4. Next up, we have the books of John. Now, the books of John generally talk a lot about love. It's interesting because the Gospel of John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son that we may have life. We have 1 John 3:16, which is also interesting. It says, we know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. And so I think it's actually interesting how those sort of complement each other in really interesting ways. And so if someone comes to you with John 3:16, come back at them with 1 John 3:16 and be good to go. And then we have 1 John chapter 4, where it talks about perfect love casts out fear, which is dope. The other books of John are really short. The second one talks about love. The third one is a commendation for hospitality. And then we have the book of Jude, which is so short that if your Bible pages stick together, you might pass by it all together. But it has some interesting teachings about heaven and hell. We have this interesting interaction where we hear about the archangel Michael contending with the devil for the body of Moses. I want to see that fight. That sounds really cool. And then we have the book of Revelations. And as I've mentioned before, the book of Revelations is how it's all going to go down. The original name of this book in Greek is Apocalypse. If you read it in Spanish, it's Apocalypsis. And it says exactly that. And so in this, John receives visions of what's going to happen in the time to come. It begins with messages to the 7 churches of Asia. And, each of these churches is lifted up for doing some things well and other things not so well. I think of note is in chapter 3, the church in Laodicea is reproved for being neither cold nor hot. And I appreciate this because it's as if to say that, if people are suffering and things aren't quite right, it's not okay to just sort of be nice to everybody and be comfortable in yourself. You have to get involved. And so I appreciate that very much. I love Revelation chapter 7 because it talks about how you have a multitude from from every nation, all languages and peoples. That's my vision of heaven for sure, and I try to make that vision a reality here. We have Revelations 12, where we have the great dragon, which is Satan, defeated by Michael. So much in Revelation is just making it clear that, don't be fooled. In the end, God wins. And so I like that. Revelation chapter 21, towards the end, it talks about how I saw no temple because the temple was the Lord. Like, I don't know. I believe that that's something that is just exciting. And imagine not having to go anywhere to worship God because God is everywhere. I feel like that's true now, and there are ways that we can make it more true. And then chapter 22, we have Jesus' final words in our scriptures where he says, I am coming soon. What soon means, I don't really know. Maybe you know. Clearly, John didn't know, but there we are. So, those are our scriptures. That's what we read throughout this month of December. And I hope and pray that you enjoyed it all. Peace and love, mi gente.